All right, hello again. This time, I'm here to introduce Shane Snow, our next speaker and one of our keynote speakers today. Shane Snow is an award-winning journalist, celebrated entrepreneur, and the best-selling author of Smart Cuts and the forthcoming Dream Teams, as well as a co-author of The Storytelling Edge. He's co-founder of the content technology company Contently, which helps creative people and companies tell great stories together, and he also serves on the board of the Contently Foundation for Investigative Journalism. Snow's writing has appeared in Fast Company, Wired, The New Yorker, and dozens more top publications. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and a recipient of the Columbia University's Innovator Award for furthering the cause of journalism. He's been called a wonderkind by the New York Times, a digital maverick by Details, and his work, Insanely Addicting, by GQ, though he wishes they'd been talking about his abs. Please welcome Shane Snow.
All right, I'd like to start with a hypothetical scenario. So close your eyes if you're not going to fall asleep. Otherwise, join me on this dark and stormy road where you're driving your brand new Tesla. So we're just talking about space. We just put a Tesla into space, so that's what we're driving. And we really like this car. So you're driving carefully through this rainstorm. And you come around a bend in the road, and you see a shadowy figure off to the side. And so, you know, this is interesting. It's pouring rain. So you slow down even more to get a look at who this could be. And you realize, to your surprise, that this is someone who saved your life many years ago. And so you say, oh my God, let me pull over and pick him up, get him out of this rain. But then you see that there's a second person standing kind of in their shadow. And you didn't see her at first because it's a little old lady. She's stooped over, she's got a cane, no umbrella, and she is not walking home on her own. So you start to process this. And then you see, to your delight and horror, that there's a third person standing next to those two. And this, to your delight, is the man or woman of your dreams. And to your horror, because for whatever reason, you know that this is your once-in-a-lifetime chance to meet him or her. And you only have one spare seat in your car. So the question is, who do you pick? You have three people, one seat, three very good reasons. I guess for some participation, we could ask, how many would pay back the person who saved you from death by picking them up? All right, we have some loyal people, grateful people in the audience. How many would pick the generosity of the little old lady? How many would pick her up? All right, we got some generous people. How many are telling the truth and would pick the man or woman of their dreams? All right, yeah, well, we're wrong. There's a right answer to this question, and it's that, of course, you should pick the old lady. Come on. But then what you need to do is give the keys to the car to your friend so they can drive her home, and you spend a romantic evening in the rain with the man or woman of your dreams, which is a way better first date story, if you think about it 50 years later, than remember the time we abandoned the old lady to her death in the monsoon? So this is one of my favorite hypothetical scenarios because it's an example of an unfair question. And a solution that uses what psychologists call lateral thinking. And it turns out that most questions in life, and especially in business, are kind of unfair. They're set up with assumptions that we often kind of take for granted. We don't question them. When I set up this question, I said you have three people, one seat in the car, ergo, you assume that you can only help one person. I also set up the assumption that you need to stay in the driver's seat of the car in order to answer this question. None of those are true. And yet so often in life and in our work, we take the questions in front of us at face value and we approach them in a very linear way. Well, psychologists in the 1970s coined this term lateral thinking for the process of approaching problems from different angles and perspectives. And it turns out that this is how innovation happens. And I've been obsessed with this over the last 10 or so years. First, as a journalist, I went to journalism school here. I started writing about business and science for magazines like Wired. And I was obsessed with this idea that breakthroughs happen in history wherever you look, whether it's in business, it's in the sciences, it's in the arts, whether it's in politics, society. Breakthroughs happen not when you play the same game, but when you play a different game. Breakthroughs always happen when someone employs lateral thinking to do something differently. And I became obsessed with this because a few years later, I started a company, and I wanted to know how can we make breakthroughs? How can we do what other people have not done? How can we succeed where others have failed? How can we change the game we're trying to play? And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of history and psychology, ended up writing this book a few years ago called Smart Cuts, which is about that. And when you think about this puzzle of the old woman in the rainstorm, the solution the most elegant solution that we could come up with, in this scenario at least so far, didn't work unless you got out of the car. So that's what I wrote about, is this idea, and people have been saying get out of outside the box for years, but getting out of the car and looking at the problem with a fresh perspective was how you solved it. And the next book that I wrote that's coming out this June is about the other side of that, is this solution did not work without the help of your friend also participating in solving this problem. So that's what this book is about, and I think that Columbia got copies for a bunch of people who registered early or something like that, which is awesome. But this book is about breakthroughs in history and how people came together. And the reason I think is relevant to talk about with this crowd is anything that you're planning on building or working on is not going to work. It's not going to be as ambitious as you anticipate unless you build the right team around it, unless you work together in the right way. And I want to start by talking about the first thing, which sucks, which is that two heads are usually not actually better than one. Research shows this over and over again, that even though the reason that we, the human species, survived was by banding together, and even though we're built for collaboration, we can make vocal sounds that animals cannot. The whites of our eyes are 3 times the size of those of other primates, so we can see what each other are doing. It helps us build things and collaborate better. And yes, this is a hipster next to a gorilla. Our brains are built for empathy, so that we can imitate each other's emotions, so that we feel motivated to help each other out. And this is how we banded together, and this is how we built civilization. It's how we survived against the saber-toothed tiger. And yet, studies show that when you're in a group of people, and you're asked to shout as loud as you can, you will shout 74% as loud as you will on your own when it's just you in front of the judges. You put people in the tug-of-war, and once you're in a group, you pull less hard in the tug-of-war. And the bigger the group, the less hard you pull, even if you're like this kid and you think you're pulling your hardest. Some of this is social loafing. Some of this is simply lost productivity because coordinating the tug-of-war is hard. But a lot of this is just psychological that we don't even realize we're doing. And then this is my favorite one. I'll explain this one through a photo series from Shutterstock that I like to call White Guy Leads Brainstorm Session, which studies repeatedly show that when you put groups of people together for brainstorming sessions, that they come up with fewer ideas and fewer quality ideas than people come up with on their own. So if you give someone an hour to think about ideas for something, they will come up with better ideas than if you put them in a group of people to come up with them together. In fact, the bigger the group, the worse this problem. To the point that a famous psychologist once said that business people must be insane to use brainstorming exercises. Another one said, as sure as cigarettes cause cancer, brainstorming in groups does not work. So that sucks. And also the thing that happens when we come together to work on things, we bring our different ideas to the table and we often end up fighting each other. I don't know how many of you have worked in big companies, but the amount of politics that you see even in a company like mine with 100 people is outrageous, and politics often devolves into shouting matches, finger pointing, and gets personal. This is just what happens when humans come together, even to the point that we try to take each other out sometimes. So the reality is, though, that anything big we ever built required a lot of people. Any innovation that ever happened because people built off of each other's work. They stood on the shoulders of giants. You can't do a heart surgery with just one person, and many jobs are simply too big for one person to handle. So we have this great paradox. So we endure this lost productivity that comes with group work, and we endure the squabbles and the enemies that we create from our different perspectives. We endure the jerks and the haters and the social loafers and who will do anything to see things their way at any cost. We avoid the ideas that are inconvenient, that we don't want around. We put up walls so that we can put our critics on the floor. We beat our plowshares into swords, and we turn nuclear energy into a bomb. And this is what happens when humans come together, which again sucks. And yet, some of us know and have felt that kind of magic when you've been part of a team that felt infinite, felt like together you could do anything, that you were more than the sum of your parts, that 1 + 1 equals more than just 2. And we've seen this throughout history when groups of people have come together, have banded together because of each other's stories, because of the empathy they have for each other, and changed the world. This is how we make progress. So we have this great paradox that when humans come together, we break down or we break through. And so the question that I had when I started working on this book is, what makes the difference? And how can we do the former and not the latter in the companies that we're running, in the communities that we're part of? And so next scenario I want to go through starts with a cake. You have a group of 8 friends that you've invited over for dinner, and you've baked a nice round cake, and you love them equally, so you want to cut this cake into 8 equal slices. But it turns out that you have an enchanted magical knife that is going to break after you make 3 slices. So you can make 3 cuts before the knife disappears. So how do you make 8 slices of cake? So most people, when I ask them this question, they cut the cake in half like a pizza, cut it in half again, and then by the 3rd and final slice, they realize that they're out of slices, and this only makes 6 slices of cake. So how do you solve this problem? Well, it turns out that you can take the first 2 steps, cut it in half again, and then if you literally turn the problem on its side, cut it all the way through, you can make 8 equal slices of cake. So this is a change in perspective that 4 of your friends will get less frosting, but I think they'll understand that you love them equally. But this change in perspective is how you solve this problem. So hang on to that, and let's go back to our dinner party. With this cake, your friends want some milk, and for whatever reason, you have 3 glasses of milk and 3 empty glasses, and you decide that you need to stagger the glasses so that it's 1 full, 1 empty, 1 full, 1 empty, and so on. So no 2 full glasses are next to each other. But for whatever reason, you can only touch 1 glass. So most people, when you ask this question, they try and do this. They try and move 1 glass in between the other 2, and then you realize that there's still 2 glasses next to each other. So how do you do this? Well, I asked this question to a lot of people, and some people get it, about 25% of people get it right off. But then when I say, now pretend you're a chemist, and you were given this problem, about 90% of people will get the answer that it's you just pour 1 glass into the other glass and put it back. So this is the other side of perspective, of what's called heuristics. So it turns out that when you combine different perspectives and different heuristics in groups of people, really interesting things happen. So here's another little diagram. Pretend that every problem that you're working on, say in your life, say in your companies, it can be represented by this mountain range or a mountain range. And every peak is a different solution to the problem that you could come up with. But like most problems in life, we're sort of hiking through fog. So you hike until you find a peak, and then you have to decide, do we go downhill and try and find another peak, or do we decide that this is the solution that works best? Usually you don't have time to hike through the whole mountain range. So what happens with perspectives and heuristics is this. Your perspective is what drops you off on a certain part of the mountain. And your heuristic is your rule of thumb, your skill, your strategy for navigating this mountain. So say you went to mountain climbing school somewhere. I'm from Idaho. We climb mountains. So at Idaho, it says go down 50 steps before, and if the slope goes up within 50 paces, then you follow that. And if the slope keeps going down, then go back to the top of your mountain. So if you're this guy, you start on the mountain in your perspective, you go up, you go down 50 paces, nope, and you found a solution to a problem, that's okay. But little do you know that there are much better solutions out there. Now, how teamwork usually works is someone on your team has been hired with a different heuristic, a different set of skills. She shows up with a similar perspective, and her mountain climbing heuristic is, I'm going to go to the trough of every mountain and see which is steeper when I get to the bottom. Whichever one's steeper, I go up. So she goes here, she gets a little further than you, she gets to here and says, oh, it's not as steep, ends up here. And if you're a good team, then she'll shout down and say, hey, I found a better solution. Teamwork, hooray. But little do we know there are better solutions to problems out there. How breakthroughs happen is when you combine these 2 ideas, when someone else, well, the first thing that happens is most of the time in our companies, most of the time in industry, we talk about best practices. It's sort of a gang of people saying, this is it, this is the way to do things. But when someone with a different perspective joins your group, or when you listen to them and pay attention to them, it's like they start off on another part of the mountain, and they get to wherever they get, whether it's good or bad. But then when you pay attention to them and say, what if we tried combining our point of view with your point of view, our heuristic with your heuristic, and this is how mathematicians, professors of complex systems, and researchers show that different brains can actually add up to better ideas than any one person could think of. So this is the math behind how that works. is called cognitive diversity. And this is the answer to the question, two heads are better than one, but only if those heads see things differently. Which brings up another paradox, though, because once again, this is how we fight because we see things differently. I'm going to kind of skip this story. It's one of my favorite examples that I've written about. I'll just go through real quick. Children's Hospital that had a problem where they were having problems with disconnecting all the machines and transferring kids out of the operating room to the recovery room. They looked at best practices. They looked at the mountain that every other hospital had sort of climbed for their solution to doing this effectively. And they didn't make a breakthrough until they actually looked at Ferrari pit crews for how they did a similar process from a different perspective, and they adopted the heuristics of a pit crew to save thousands of kids' lives. It's the fastest version of that story I've ever told. But the idea that the combination of perspectives and heuristics is how your team will make breakthroughs. And yet, in order to do that, those different heuristics and perspectives need to bump against each other. So you can't be on the mountain and say, we're not listening to that guy over there who has the different idea. Or, hey, get with the program, get on our mountain and fit our culture, fit our values that we've dictated because this is the way things are done. That's not how innovation happens. That's how innovation happens around you and disrupts you and finds a different mountain. And so what you need is not just cognitive diversity, but you need cognitive friction, which this is sort of my favorite diversion. This is actually how we got hip-hop. So I don't know how many of you know the history of hip-hop that emerged in the Bronx, but it started with DJs that would throw a party, and there'd be two DJs on different sides of the dance hall. And your job was to have the best music so that people danced on your side of the hall. So every week they would come, and different DJs would try different music, different sound equipment, and whichever side the party went to, they won. And so after a little while, the DJ's hype man, the MC, would start rhyming and sort of dissing the other DJ. People would start having dance competitions. And every week, if you lost one of these competitions, you came back prepared to win the next week. And through this process, which turns out isn't just the process of how hip-hop happened, it's the process of how many great innovations in history happened, DJs hacked their equipment. They built fader switches that didn't exist. They broke open computers. They helped actually develop a lot of the computing industry. And they also created new genres of music that wouldn't have existed if they had not had this battle that they had to come and adapt every week to do. So innovation is born of the friction between different ways of thinking, but it doesn't work unless you're willing to adapt. And so it's kind of like you have a rubber band. The rubber band has no energy unless you stretch it. But at a certain point, the rubber band's going to break. So you want to keep your relationship, your working relationship when you're working on things, in this zone of possibility in between destruction and inertia by not stretching the band too far, but stretching it. But most of us are afraid of the pain when the rubber band snaps. And so we're afraid to engage in the friction between our different perspectives and heuristics. So there's one more element in this equation, and real quick, it comes from the story of these two gentlemen here who were fabulous collaborators, but very different. One was sort of cerebral and quiet, the other was impetuous and loud. And their process for working on problems was they would show up to work and start shouting at each other. They'd pick one side of an argument and they'd just start yelling, and their assistants were worried and the neighbors were worried. And then at lunchtime, they would eat lunch, and then they'd switch sides of the argument. And they'd resume shouting, but each one had to take the other man's side. And if this sounds like an abusive work environment, you'll forgive them because if you don't recognize them here, you will hear these are the inventors of human flight. Orville and Wilbur had this process where they knew that if they were too married to their own perspectives, their own ideas, their ego was attached to what they were working on, they would not make breakthroughs together. And because they were brothers, because they did think kind of similarly, they had to force themselves to get on different mountaintops and have these battles. And so, this is kind of that lesson that we need to be able to change our viewpoint for any of this to make sense, for any of this to work. And if we don't, that's how things blow up. But at a certain point, they're yelling at each other, and Orville decides he's going to murder Wilbur, and that's when they switch sides of the argument. So this only works if you have the strategy or the humility to make this kind of thing happen. And so this is, I think, the great virtue, actually, that's missing in our society today, and the thing that if you nail in your teams, the sky is the limit. It's this idea of intellectual humility, which is being able to transcend your own way of thinking, and yet being smart enough to know when you shouldn't. So being willing to look at the other side of the mountain, to consider perspectives that you think are wrong, to have those battles, but to show up the next week not doing just the same thing because you're stubborn and you're married to what you thought was the right idea in the first place. So when you think about that scenario on the road, kind of the other element of it, yes, you had to get out of the car. Yes, you needed the help of your friend, but you also had to be willing to listen when your friend said, hey, I have this heuristic. I have this different approach. I have this skill that I have that you can use. And you have to also listen to the old lady when she says, hey, you should really make this decision. You should follow my perspective. You have to consider all of these and mix these together and have the humility to change, but also the fortitude to know when not to change. So last thing I'll end with is that if there's a meta lesson to anything that we're working on in life and in our companies, it's that we have it backwards when we think about innovation. Innovation is not about being the strongest. It's not about being the smartest. It's not about being the fastest. It's about being flexible. And teams that can work together and be flexible are the ones that are going to change the world. So, as I like to say, I think genius has less to do with the size of your mind than how open it is. So let's keep that in mind. Thank you very much for having me.